a shadow on the edge of oblivion. The desolate ruins of Earth's outskirts were cloaked in silence, the stillness broken only by the occasional wail of wind slicing through the skeletal remains of ancient skyscrapers. Mirren, an alien vampire of a race once revered as gods, stood amidst the rubble. Her obsidian-black skin shimmered faintly under the pale light of twin moons, a cruel reminder of the energy her body once radiated. She was a shadow of her former self, a being of power and grace reduced to a fugitive, clinging to the edges of survival. For centuries, her kind had ruled with unmatched intellect and strength, conquering worlds and bending lesser species to their will. The humans, though primitive in comparison, had always been considered little more than an afterthought, a species that burned brightly but briefly, destined to crumble under the weight of their own wars. And yet, it was these very creatures who had dismantled her empire. Through ingenuity, tenacity, and a sheer unwillingness to surrender, humanity had brought her people to their knees. Mirren leaned against the jagged remains of a building, her energy reserves nearly depleted. Her sharp claws traced the scars on the wall, remnants of an old battle. Hunger clawed at her insides, a relentless torment she could no longer ignore. Her kind thrived on blood, not just as sustenance, but as the essence that fueled their otherworldly abilities. Without it, her strength diminished with every passing day. The faint sound of footsteps echoed in the distance, pulling her from her thoughts. Mirren's crimson eyes narrowed as she scanned the horizon. She crouched low, her sleek form blending into the shadows. It was a human, she could tell from the rhythmic pattern of the steps, deliberate and unhurried. Her instincts screamed at her to flee. Humans had become the predators now, and she their prey. But something held her rooted in place, a flicker of curiosity perhaps, or the faint hope that this one might bring her the death she had come to accept as inevitable. The human emerged from the misty ruins, a figure clad in scavenged armor that bore the scars of countless battles. He carried no weapon, at least none she could see, and instead of the hostility she expected, his face wore an expression of calm determination. He stopped a few paces away, his eyes locking onto hers with unnerving confidence. "I know you're there," he said, his voice steady but not unkind. "You don't have to hide." Mirren's lips curled back, revealing sharp fangs. "What are you waiting for, human?" she rasped, her voice low and rough from disuse. "Strike me down. Take your victory." The man shook his head. "I didn't come to kill you." She froze, her mind racing. This had to be a trick, a trap to lure her out into the open. "Then why are you here?" she asked, her tone laced with suspicion. The human crouched, carefully setting down a satchel he had been carrying. "To help you." Mirren's laughter was bitter, a sound like shattered glass. "Help me? Your kind has done nothing but destroy. You've hunted us, pushed us to extinction, and now you want to help?" He didn't flinch at her words. Instead, he opened the satchel to reveal sealed packets of blood, the crimson liquid gleaming in the moonlight. "I salvaged these from an old medical center," he explained. "I know you need it to survive." Her instincts screamed at her to lunge, to take the blood and flee. But she hesitated, the weight of countless betrayals pressing down on her. "Why would you do this?" she demanded. "What could you possibly gain from helping me?" The man met her gaze without hesitation. "Because I don't believe all of you are monsters. And maybe, just maybe, if we stop fighting, there's a chance for something better." Mirren stared at him, searching his face for any hint of deceit. She found none. Slowly, she reached out, her clawed hand trembling as it closed around one of the packets. The hunger was overwhelming, and the moment the blood touched her lips, warmth surged through her body. It wasn't enough to restore her former strength, but it staved off the creeping weakness for now. "What's your name?" she asked, her voice softer but no less wary. "Elias," he replied. "And yours?" She hesitated before answering, the name feeling foreign on her tongue after so many years of silence. "Mirren." Elias nodded. "Well, Mirren, you're not alone anymore." Those words struck her like a blow. She had been alone for so long that she'd forgotten what it felt like to hear them. The kindness in his voice stirred something deep within her, something she thought had died alongside her people, hope. For the first time in centuries, Mirren dared to believe that her story might not end in darkness. She didn't trust Elias, not yet, but for now, she would follow his lead. Survival demanded it, and perhaps, in time, she might come to understand the strange human who had offered her a lifeline in a world that had long since turned its back on her. As they walked into the ruins together, Mirren felt the faintest flicker of something she had lost long ago. It wasn't strength, nor vengeance, but the fragile beginnings of trust. And in the vast expanse of uncertainty that lay ahead, that small spark was enough to keep her moving forward. This first part sets the tone and builds intrigue while maintaining a strong emotional core. Let me know if you'd like to adjust any part or continue with the next section. Fragile bonds in a broken world. The ruins stretched endlessly before them, a labyrinth of crumbling concrete and twisted steel. Mirren walked a step behind Elias, her sharp gaze scanning the surroundings for any sign of danger. Trust did not come easily to her. Centuries of betrayal and conflict had taught her that survival often demanded solitude. Yet, here she was, walking alongside a human. A species she had once considered insignificant, and later, an implacable enemy. Elias seemed oblivious to her attention, his stride relaxed but purposeful. His satchel swayed gently at his side, now significantly lighter after the offering he had made. Mirren still wasn't sure what to make of him. Was he naive? Reckless? Or did he truly believe in the possibility of coexistence? "Where are we going?" she asked finally, breaking the heavy silence between them. "There's a shelter nearby," Elias replied without turning. "It's not much, but it's safe. We can rest there." Mirren bristled at the word "we." She was not used to being grouped with anyone, let alone a human. "And why should I trust you?" she countered, her tone sharp. "For all I know, this could be a trap." Elias stopped abruptly and turned to face her, his expression calm but resolute. "You shouldn't trust me, not yet. But if I wanted to harm you, I wouldn't have given you the blood. I wouldn't be walking unarmed." He gestured to his empty hands as if to emphasize the point. "I'm not asking for blind trust, Mirren. Just, give me a chance." His honesty disarmed her more than any weapon could have. She hated how his words stirred something within her, a flicker of curiosity mingled with reluctant hope. Against her better judgment, she nodded, and they continued their journey. The shelter. When they reached the shelter, Mirren was struck by its simplicity. It was an old maintenance bunker, half buried beneath layers of dirt and debris. The entrance was concealed by overgrown foliage, making it almost invisible to passers-by. Elias pulled aside a makeshift camouflage net and gestured for her to enter. Inside, the space was sparse but functional. A small generator hummed quietly in the corner, casting a faint glow over the room. There was a cot against one wall, a table cluttered with tools and supplies, and shelves stocked with canned goods and water bottles. Mirren noted the meticulous organization, a stark contrast to the chaos outside. "This is where you live?" she asked, her tone laced with skepticism. "For now," Elias replied, setting his satchel on the table. "It's not much, but it's safe. And it's kept me alive." Mirren wandered the room, her claws trailing lightly over the shelves. She stopped at a small, battered photograph pinned to the wall. It depicted a younger Elias, standing between two smiling figures, a man and a woman. "Your family?" she asked, her voice softer now. Elias glanced at the photo and nodded. "They're gone. Lost them during the first wave of your invasion." The words hung heavily in the air, a stark reminder of the blood-soaked history between their peoples. Mirren turned away from the photo, guilt flickering in her crimson eyes. "I didn't choose this war," she said quietly. "None of us did. We were following orders." "Maybe," Elias said, his tone neutral. "But orders don't justify everything. We both know that." A shared meal. Elias busied himself preparing a meal while Mirren sat on the edge of the cot, watching him with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. He heated a can of stew over a small portable stove, the aroma filling the room. Mirren's enhanced senses picked up every detail, the rich scent of the broth, the subtle spices. Her kind did not eat conventional food, but she could still appreciate the sensory experience. "Do you miss it?" Elias asked suddenly, breaking the silence. "Miss what?" Your home. Your people. Mirren hesitated, the question catching her off guard. Every day, she admitted finally. We were explorers, builders. Our empire spanned countless worlds. And now, she trailed off, her gaze distant. Now we're nothing more than ghosts. Elias placed a bowl of stew in front of her and sat down across the table. Not ghosts. Survivors. The simplicity of his statement struck her. It was a human trait she had come to both admire and fear, their ability to endure, to find hope even in the face of utter devastation. You speak as if survival is something to be proud of, she said, her tone tinged with bitterness. It is, Elias replied. Because survival means there's still a chance. A chance to rebuild, to do better. Uneasy allies. Over the next few days, an uneasy rhythm developed between them. Mirren's strength began to return, thanks to the blood Elias had provided. In exchange, she shared fragments of her knowledge, details about the stars, the advanced technology of her people, and the secrets of their downfall. Elias listened intently, his questions probing but respectful. He seemed genuinely fascinated by her stories, and for the first time in centuries, Mirren found herself speaking freely, unburdening the weight of her past. But trust was a fragile thing, and old habits died hard. Mirren kept a wary eye on him, always prepared for the possibility of betrayal. Elias, for his part, seemed determined to prove her wrong. He never pushed her boundaries, never demanded more than she was willing to give. One evening, as they sat in the dim light of the shelter, Elias turned to her with a question that caught her off guard. Do you think peace is possible? Between our people? Mirren's first instinct was to dismiss the idea as foolish. But as she looked into his earnest eyes, she found herself hesitating. I don't know, she admitted. Maybe. But it would take more than just the two of us. Elias nodded thoughtfully. Then maybe we start with just us. One step at a time. For the first time, Mirren allowed herself to consider the possibility. Perhaps peace wasn't an unattainable dream. Perhaps, against all odds, it could begin with a human and an alien vampire, united by necessity and bound by fragile trust. Shadows of the past. The nights in the shelter were long, filled with an uneasy stillness. Mirren often found herself awake, staring at the low ceiling, her mind a battlefield of conflicting thoughts. Elias's shelter was a strange bubble of safety in a world that had become her enemy. For centuries, she had lived with the knowledge that her kind was superior, destined to rule. Now, with her empire gone and her survival dependent on a human, she questioned everything she had once believed. Elias had fallen into a light sleep in his corner of the room, his breathing steady. Mirren envied the simplicity of his rest. Even now, with her strength gradually returning, she couldn't shake the paranoia that had kept her alive for so long. She rose quietly, her movements fluid and silent as she slipped outside into the cool night air. The night's watch. The ruins stretched out before her, bathed in the silvery glow of the twin moons. Mirren inhaled deeply, savoring the crisp air. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel a fragment of peace. But the peace was fleeting. Her sharp ears caught the faintest sound, a rustle, distant but deliberate. Instincts honed over centuries kicked in, and she melted into the shadows, her crimson eyes scanning the darkness. A group of figures emerged from the ruins, their silhouettes sharp against the moonlight. Humans, but not like Elias. These were scavengers, their ragged clothes adorned with makeshift armor. They carried weapons, crude but lethal, and moved with the practiced ease of predators. Mirren's hands tightened into fists as she observed them. They weren't here by chance. She slipped back into the shelter, her voice a low hiss. Elias, wake up. He stirred, blinking groggily before sitting up. What is it? Trouble, she replied, nodding toward the entrance. Humans. Armed. They're coming this way. Elias frowned, rising to his feet. Scavengers, he muttered. They must have followed me. Followed you? Mirren's tone was sharp. You led them here? I didn't know they were tracking me, Elias shot back, his voice defensive. They must have seen me bringing supplies. Mirren's eyes narrowed, but she pushed her anger aside. Now wasn't the time for blame. We need to move. Now. An uneasy escape. The two of them slipped out of the shelter through a hidden back entrance, moving swiftly and silently through the ruins. Mirren's heightened senses guided them, her ears attuned to the faintest noise, her eyes catching even the smallest movement in the shadows. Elias followed her lead without question, his trust in her growing despite the circumstances. They reached a narrow alleyway, the walls crumbling on either side. Mirren paused, her senses prickling. "They're close," she whispered. "Too close." Elias scanned the area, his hand instinctively reaching for the knife he kept at his belt. "What's the plan?" Mirren hesitated. Her instincts told her to fight, to eliminate the threat before it could grow. But she wasn't alone anymore. She had to consider Elias, his safety, his limitations. "We split up," she said finally. "I'll draw them away. You keep moving." "No," Elias said firmly. "We stay together." Her eyes flashed with irritation. "I'm faster, stronger. I can handle them. And if you don't come back," he countered. "If this is a trap, you'll be walking right into it. We're better off sticking together." His stubbornness surprised her, but she couldn't deny the logic in his words. She nodded reluctantly. "Fine. But stay behind me." The confrontation. The scavengers found them moments later, their leader, a wiry man with a cruel smile, stepping forward. "Well, what do we have here?" he sneered. "A scavenger and his pet." Mirren's claws flexed at her sides, her crimson eyes locking onto the leader. "Leave now," she said coldly. "Or you won't leave at all." The man laughed, a harsh sound that echoed through the ruins. "Feisty. I like that." He turned to his group. "Take the man. Kill the creature." The scavengers moved as one, their weapons raised. Mirren exploded into action, her movements a blur of speed and precision. Her claws tore through the air, disarming one of the men before he could react. She spun, her foot connecting with another's chest, sending him sprawling. Elias held his own, using his knife to fend off an attacker who came too close. He wasn't as fast or strong as Mirren, but his determination and quick thinking kept him alive. He ducked under a swing, using the momentum to knock his opponent off balance. The fight was brutal but brief. Mirren's superior strength and agility proved too much for the scavengers. Within minutes, the survivors were retreating, their leader among them. Mirren watched them go, her chest heaving, her claws dripping with blood. Elias stepped forward, his eyes scanning the scene. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. "I'm fine," she replied curtly, wiping her hands on her tattered clothing. "You?" "I'll live," he said, though the gash on his arm suggested otherwise. Aftermath. They found temporary refuge in an abandoned building, the walls still intact enough to provide some semblance of security. Mirren tended to Elias's wound, her movements surprisingly gentle for someone so fierce. He winced but didn't pull away. "You didn't have to stay," she said quietly. "You could have left. And let you handle them alone?" He shook his head. "That's not how I do things." Mirren studied him, her expression unreadable. "You're a strange human." "Maybe," he said with a faint smile. "But we make a good team." For the first time, she didn't argue. Despite her initial doubts, Elias had proven himself. He wasn't just another human. He was something different, something she couldn't quite define. And for the first time in a long while, Mirren felt the faint stirrings of something she had thought lost forever, trust. As the first rays of dawn broke over the ruins, the two of them sat in silence, the unspoken bond between them growing stronger. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with danger and doubt, but for now, they had each other. And in a world as broken as this, that was enough. Echoes of the forgotten. The first light of dawn crept over the ruins, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly across the battered landscape. Mirren sat silently by the cracked window of their newfound refuge, her sharp eyes scanning the horizon. The fight with the scavengers had left her more unsettled than she cared to admit. She was no stranger to violence, her kind had thrived on it for centuries, but this fight had felt different. It wasn't just her life at stake anymore. For reasons she couldn't fully understand, Elias's survival had become just as important. Behind her, Elias stirred, wincing as he moved his injured arm. Mirren had cleaned and dressed the wound with surprising care, though she had refused to meet his gaze as she worked. Now, as he sat up on the makeshift cot, he broke the silence. "Do you ever wonder what it would have been like if our peoples had met under different circumstances?" he asked, his voice low and thoughtful. Mirren glanced back at him, her expression guarded. "What do you mean?" "I mean, if there hadn't been a war. If we'd met as explorers, not enemies. What do you think would have happened?" She considered his question, her crimson eyes narrowing. "Your kind would have feared us. Resisted us. It's what you do." Elias chuckled softly, though the sound was tinged with bitterness. "You're probably right. Fear is one of humanity's specialties. But it's not the only thing we're good at." "Like what?" she challenged, her tone sharper than she intended. "Adaptation," he said simply. "We learn. We grow. And sometimes, when we're lucky, we overcome the worst parts of ourselves." Mirren looked away, her gaze returning to the horizon. "Your kind overcame us." "That wasn't overcoming," Elias replied. "That was survival. There's a difference." The unlikely scholar. The hours passed in relative silence, the two of them conserving their energy. Mirren finally broke the quiet by rummaging through her small bag of belongings. Among the items was a small, silver device, smooth and circular, with faintly glowing symbols etched into its surface. Elias leaned forward, curiosity lighting up his face. "What's that?" "A data core," Mirren replied, her tone tinged with reverence. "It contains fragments of my people's knowledge. Histories, technologies, even star maps." Elias's eyes widened. "You've been carrying that this whole time?" "It's all that's left of our legacy," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Without it, everything we were, everything we achieved, will be forgotten." He hesitated before asking, "Can you still access it?" She shook her head. "Not without the right interface. And even if I could, there's no one left to share it with." Elias frowned, his mind clearly racing. "What if you're wrong about that? What if there's a way to rebuild, to share your legacy with the universe again?" Mirren laughed bitterly. "You think the universe is ready to welcome us back? We were conquerors, Elias. Invaders. No one will mourn our absence." "Maybe not," he admitted. "But maybe it's not about the universe. Maybe it's about you. About holding on to something that proves your people were more than just warriors." Her gaze softened, the weight of his words settling over her. She had always thought of the data core as a relic of a lost past, but perhaps Elias was right. Perhaps it could also be a beacon for the future. A journey begins. That evening, as the shadows deepened, Elias unfolded a map he had scavenged from an old library. The paper was fragile, its edges frayed, but the markings were clear. He pointed to a spot several miles away, encircled in red ink. "There's a place here," he said. "An old research facility. It was abandoned after the war, but I've heard rumors that some of the technology is still intact." Mirren raised an eyebrow. "And you think this facility will have what we need?" "It's worth a shot," Elias replied. "If nothing else, it's a step forward. Better than sitting here, waiting for more scavengers to show up." Mirren considered his proposal. It was risky, traveling through the ruins always was, but staying in one place carried its own dangers. And the idea of accessing the data core, of preserving what little remained of her people's knowledge, stirred something within her. "Fine," she said finally. "We'll go. But if this is another one of your reckless ideas, I'm leaving you behind." Elias smirked. "Noted." Through the wasteland. The journey to the facility was grueling. The landscape was a treacherous maze of crumbled buildings, tangled vegetation, and hidden dangers. Mirren moved with practiced ease, her heightened senses guiding them away from potential threats. Elias, for all his resilience, struggled to keep up, his injured arm slowing him down. At one point, they stumbled upon the remnants of an old battlefield. The ground was littered with rusted weapons and broken machinery, the air heavy with the lingering scent of decay. Mirren paused, her gaze lingering on a shattered alien ship half buried in the dirt. "This was one of ours," she murmured, her voice barely audible. Elias placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch tentative but reassuring. "I'm sorry." She didn't respond, but the gesture wasn't lost on her. They moved on, the weight of the past pressing heavily on both of them. Arrival at the facility. When they finally reached the research facility, it was clear that time had not been kind to it. The building was partially collapsed, its outer walls covered in moss and vines. Mirren approached cautiously, her claws flexing as she tested the air for signs of life. "It looks abandoned," Elias said, though his tone betrayed his wariness. "Looks can be deceiving," Mirren replied. "Stay close." Inside, the facility was a labyrinth of dark corridors and flickering lights. The air was stale, and the silence was oppressive. Mirren led the way, her movements swift and deliberate, while Elias followed with a flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness. They found the main laboratory at the heart of the facility. Despite the decay, some of the equipment still hummed faintly with power. Mirren's eyes lit up as she recognized several devices, their alien designs unmistakable. "This could work," she said, a rare note of hope in her voice. Elias grinned. "See? Reckless ideas aren't all bad." She rolled her eyes but didn't argue. Together, they began to explore the lab, their partnership growing stronger with each passing moment. The journey ahead would be fraught with challenges, but for the first time in a long while, Mirren felt something she thought she'd lost forever: purpose, the labyrinth of memories. The research facility's cavernous interior felt alive, humming faintly with remnants of its former purpose. Mirren moved swiftly, her crimson eyes scanning the dimly lit room for any sign of danger. The air was stale, carrying the faint metallic tang of decayed machinery. Elias trailed behind her, his flashlight casting jagged shadows on the walls. Though his steps were cautious, he couldn't help but marvel at the alien architecture that dominated the space: sleek, efficient, and so different from the crude remnants of human ingenuity he had grown used to. "This place feels wrong," Elias murmured, his voice barely audible over the distant hum of dormant machines. Mirren glanced back at him, her expression unreadable. "It's not wrong, it's alive. These systems are still functioning, at least partially." "Alive?" Elias asked, his brow furrowing. "You mean, aware?" "Not exactly," Mirren replied, running her clawed fingers over a panel etched with glowing symbols. "Think of it as a sleeping giant. Dormant, but not dead." Her touch triggered a response, and the panel lit up with a soft blue glow. Symbols flickered across the screen, indecipherable to Elias but instantly familiar to Mirren. She frowned as she deciphered the data. "The power levels are low," she muttered. "If we're going to access the core, we'll need to reroute energy to this section." Elias glanced around the room, noting the exposed wires and sparking consoles. "Reroute power? From where?" Mirren's lips pressed into a thin line. "The reactor. If it's still operational, we might be able to restart it." The reactor room. The path to the reactor was treacherous, with sections of the facility caved in, forcing them to climb over rubble and navigate narrow passages. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the air became. Mirren led the way, her movements confident despite the growing tension in her expression. When they reached the reactor room, it was a marvel of alien engineering. Massive conduits spiraled upward, connecting to a central core that pulsed faintly with a dim light. Mirren approached the control panel, her claws moving deftly over the symbols. "It's damaged," she said, her voice tight. "But it's not beyond repair." Elias stood beside her, studying the console. "What do you need me to do?" Mirren glanced at him, surprised by his willingness to help despite the danger. "There are conduits along the walls," she explained, pointing to a series of pipes and wires. "Some of them are severed. If we can reconnect them, it should stabilize the flow of energy." Elias nodded. Got it. Just tell me where to start. A race against time. As Elias worked to reconnect the conduits, Mirren focused on calibrating the reactor's control panel. The room filled with a low hum, the dormant machinery slowly coming back to life. Sparks flew as Elias reconnected a particularly stubborn wire, his hands steady despite the strain. Almost there, he called out, wiping sweat from his brow. How's it looking on your end? Mirren's fingers moved rapidly over the controls, her expression focused. The energy levels are rising, but it's unstable. We need one more connection. Elias climbed to a higher platform, where a tangle of wires hung precariously. He reached for them, his injured arm protesting with a sharp pang. Gritting his teeth, he forced himself to push through the pain. You're going to get yourself killed, Mirren muttered, though there was a trace of concern in her voice. Elias smirked despite himself. Wouldn't be the first time someone said that. With a final surge of effort, he reconnected the wires. The reactor roared to life, the room flooding with light. Mirren stepped back, shielding her eyes as the systems began to stabilize. It's working, she said, a rare note of triumph in her voice. Uncovering the past. With the reactor online, the facility's systems were restored, and Mirren led Elias back to the central laboratory. The glowing panel she had activated earlier now displayed a cascade of data. She placed the data core into a circular slot on the console, and the screen shifted, displaying intricate star maps and streams of information. Elias watched in awe as Mirren navigated the interface, her expression a mixture of nostalgia and determination. This is incredible, he said. It's like a window into your people's history. Mirren's gaze softened as she studied the maps. It's more than that. These are records of our exploration, our discoveries. Everything we were before the war. Elias leaned closer, his eyes tracing the glowing lines of the star maps. You said earlier that no one would mourn your people's absence. But this proves you were more than conquerors. There's beauty in what you created. Mirren hesitated, her claws hovering over the console. For centuries, she had carried the weight of her people's downfall, convinced that their legacy was one of destruction. But as she looked at the data before her, she realized Elias was right. There was more to their story, a legacy worth preserving. The warning. As they delved deeper into the data, an unexpected discovery stopped them in their tracks. Among the records was a message, encoded and hidden within the core. Mirren's eyes widened as she deciphered it. It's a warning, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Elias frowned. A warning about what? An invasion, she replied, her expression darkening. Not from my people, but something far worse. A force that wiped out entire systems before we ever encountered your kind. Elias's blood ran cold. And now it's heading here? Mirren nodded grimly. If this data is accurate, we don't have much time. The weight of her words settled heavily between them. The fragile alliance they had formed was no longer just about survival, it was about preparing for a threat that could destroy them all. A new mission. Elias stood straighter, his jaw set with determination. Then we don't have a choice. We have to warn everyone, your people, my people. If we don't work together, there won't be anything left to fight for. Mirren studied him, her crimson eyes searching his face. For the first time, she saw something more than resilience in him. She saw a spark of the very thing her people had lost, hope. You're a fool, she said, though there was no malice in her tone. But perhaps that's exactly what we need. As they began preparing for their next steps, the weight of the impending threat loomed large. Yet, amidst the uncertainty, a fragile bond had been forged, a partnership that might just hold the key to humanity's and Mirren's survival. The storm approaches. The facility had grown eerily quiet again, the hum of the reactor and the soft glow of the screens the only signs of life in the cold, abandoned complex. Mirren and Elias stood side by side, the weight of the warning message they had uncovered still hanging heavily in the air. What they had found in the data core was a revelation, and a terrifying one at that. This threat, it's not just some rogue faction, Elias said, his voice laced with disbelief. It's something much worse. Mirren nodded, her eyes focused on the map of star systems that glowed ominously on the console in front of them. The data shows that this force wiped out entire civilizations, entire worlds, without mercy. It doesn't negotiate or fight, it just consumes everything in its path. The human leaned in closer, examining the data more carefully. And your people, they fought them off? Is that why you went to war with us? Mirren's fingers hovered over the glowing symbols as she sighed. No. We didn't fight them off. We tried, but we failed. The war with humanity was a distraction. We were too focused on our own survival to realize that something much worse was looming in the dark. Elias frowned, absorbing the enormity of the situation. And now that it's here, what do we do? I don't know, Mirren admitted. But we have to act fast. This enemy will not stop until it has consumed everything. There is no negotiating with them, no truce. The only way to survive is to fight them. Elias turned to her, determination etched on his face. Then we fight. We don't have the luxury of waiting. The first step, uniting the resistance. The days that followed were a whirlwind of preparation. Mirren and Elias scoured the facility's archives for anything that could help them prepare for the coming storm, hoping to find a weapon or a strategy that might give them a fighting chance. But the more they searched, the more it became clear that their chances were slim. What if we don't have enough time? Elias asked one evening, sitting cross-legged on the floor, his brow furrowed as he reviewed maps and blueprints. What if we can't convince anyone else to fight? Mirren stood by the window, gazing out over the vast, broken landscape. We don't have time to convince everyone, she said. We need to find the resistance, the survivors who fought alongside my people when the war first broke out. They will understand the gravity of what's coming. Elias nodded, his mind already working through the logistics. There are still pockets of humanity scattered across the planet. Small groups, isolated, but strong. If we can find them. If we can find them, we can unite them, Mirren finished for him. And if we unite them, we stand a chance. It was a long shot, there were no guarantees. But it was all they had. The search begins. The search for the resistance was as perilous as it was exhausting. Mirren and Elias traversed dangerous territories, navigating the war-torn landscape with a mix of stealth and strategy. Mirren's speed and strength made her an invaluable asset, but Elias's knowledge of human survival tactics proved just as critical. He had lived through countless dangers, from marauding bands of scavengers to the constant threat of environmental collapse. Together, they made an effective team, a team that slowly, but steadily, began to uncover the hidden strongholds of human survivors. One night, as they sat around a small campfire in the ruins of a city that had once thrived, Elias turned to Mirren, his expression somber. There are rumors of a group, he said. They call themselves the Last Light. They were once part of the military resistance. They might still be alive. Mirren glanced at him, her gaze unwavering. Where can we find them? Elias looked down at the map in his hands, his finger tracing a route. North. It's a risky journey, but they're known to operate in the outskirts of what used to be the northern capital. Then we go north, Mirren said decisively, rising to her feet. We find them. And we bring them together. The long road ahead. The journey north was treacherous, the path fraught with danger at every turn. The world around them had become an unforgiving wasteland, a testament to the brutal war that had ravaged it. Yet, despite the desolation, there were signs of resilience. Here and there, they saw traces of life, small gardens in hidden corners, makeshift shelters constructed from the remnants of old cities, and the occasional flicker of light in the distance as survivors lit their small fires. Throughout the journey, the bond between Mirren and Elias deepened. Mirren had come to rely on him in ways she hadn't expected. His ingenuity, his ability to adapt to any situation, and his unyielding hope were like a tether to a world she had long thought lost. In return, Elias had begun to trust her in ways he never thought possible. Despite their differences, despite the vast chasm between their species, they were learning to fight side by side. One night, as they sat by a fire, Mirren turned to him, her voice uncharacteristically soft. Elias, I never imagined that things would turn out this way. I thought I was beyond redemption. He met her gaze, his face illuminated by the flickering firelight. You're not beyond redemption, Mirren. Neither of us are. Mirren's lips curled into a faint, uncertain smile. Perhaps. But the choices we make now, they will define us. Elias didn't respond immediately. Instead, he simply nodded. Then let's make the right ones. A glimmer of hope. As they neared the northern capital, they began to notice more signs of resistance. A hidden outpost, camouflaged against the crumbling cityscape, was their first real clue that they were on the right track. They approached cautiously, keeping to the shadows, their weapons ready. When they finally reached the outpost, they were met by a grizzled soldier who regarded them with suspicion. Who are you? The soldier demanded, his weapon aimed but not yet fired. We come from the south, Elias replied, his voice steady. We've got news. There's a threat far worse than anything we've faced before. The kind of enemy that doesn't just conquer, it destroys. And we need your help to stop it. The soldier studied them for a long moment before lowering his weapon slightly. You'd better come with me.